It is settled, then. We are friends now.
Yes, friends indeed.
It began with a handshake that stunned the world. Two men who spent years screaming about destroying each other suddenly appeared side by side, smiling like business partners at a real estate closing. Hitler and Stalin, the two architects of the most violent ideologies in Europe, signed a non-aggression pact that promised peace while both parties prepared for war. To anyone who followed their rise, the pact made no sense. Hitler built his entire political identity on the idea that Bolshevism was a disease. Stalin spent the same years warning the Soviet people that fascism was a rabid beast that needed to be crushed before it could spread. Yet on August 23, 1939, these so-called mortal enemies announced to the world that they were now friends. It was the kind of friendship that only works when both people are planning to betray each other the moment the ink dries. The public reaction was shock mixed with disbelief. Western diplomats scrambled to understand how the Nazis and Soviets, two powers that hated each other on every ideological level, could suddenly agree on anything. Newspapers ran headlines that looked like satire. Political commentators tried to interpret the deal as a clever trick or a temporary alliance built on necessity. Many ordinary people assumed it was fake. To them, it seemed impossible. They expected Hitler to invade the Soviet Union at any moment, and they assumed Stalin would never trust a man who openly promised to destroy the Slavic world. But that disbelief only revealed how the propaganda from both sides had shaped public expectations. The pact exposed a truth that nobody wanted to admit. For both regimes, ideology mattered only when it benefited their interests. While the public heard nothing but soothing statements about peace and mutual respect, the actual heart of the agreement remained buried beneath a layer of secrecy. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not gain its infamous reputation because of the handshake or the nice speeches. It earned that infamy because of the secret protocol attached to it. This protocol divided Eastern Europe like a butcher slicing an animal for parts. Poland was cut down the middle. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were placed under Soviet control. Finland was assigned to Stalin's sphere. Germany was given a free hand in the west of Poland. None of the nations mentioned had any idea their futures were being decided without them. The entire protocol assumed that their independence was irrelevant, their borders negotiable, and their people expendable. In those private documents, the true purpose of the pact became obvious. This was not about avoiding war. It was about preparing for it. Both powers understood that carving up Eastern Europe would ease the path for German expansion and Soviet consolidation. Hitler wanted a war in Poland without interference from the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted time to rebuild the Red Army after his disastrous purges, which had destroyed military leadership at every level. To achieve these goals, they needed each other. Not as allies, not as partners, but as temporary tools. The most dramatic proof of this cynical arrangement came only days later. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. Nazi troops swept across the border while Hitler justified the attack with lies about Polish aggression. Western powers, bound by treaties, declared war on Germany. The world plunged into the largest conflict in human history. 17 days later, as Poland struggled to hold the line, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Stalin pretended his invasion was a humanitarian mission to protect ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians. The lie was thin, and everyone knew it. Soviet tanks rolled in because the secret protocol demanded it. Poland, a nation trapped between two predators, collapsed under the weight of the coordinated assault. For the ordinary observer, this moment revealed the pact's real nature. Germany and the Soviet Union did not cooperate because they trusted each other. They cooperated because attacking Poland together gave each side something they wanted. Hitler gained a free hand, more territory, and a buffer that protected Germany from a two-front war, at least temporarily. Stalin gained breathing room, land, and strategic depth for the inevitable conflict with Germany that he predicted, but hoped to delay. Their armies pretended to be neutral. Their diplomats spoke of mutual respect. Their soldiers, meanwhile, stood side by side in captured Polish towns, watching each other with suspicion. The signing ceremony added another layer of absurdity to the story. Soviet citizens were forced to read newspaper articles praising Germany as a peace-loving partner. Nazi newspapers, in turn, printed propaganda that described the Soviet Union as a reliable friend. This public performance fooled nobody inside either regime. German military leaders continued to plan for a future war against the Soviet Union. Stalin remained convinced that Hitler would honor the pact only as long as it suited him. The absurd part was not the alliance itself, but the speed with which both sides tried to pretend their previous hatred had evaporated. To make the performance even more surreal, Stalin held a banquet for the Nazi delegation. Witnesses later described one of the most awkward diplomatic dinners in history. Toasts were made. Smiles were forced. Stalin raised a glass to Hitler, calling him a man of peace. It was a statement that sounded ridiculous, even to those in the room. Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, responded with equal levels of insincere enthusiasm. He praised Stalin's wisdom as if the past decade of anti-communist rhetoric had never existed. The entire scene was a polite facade built on lies, one that provided a thin political cover for the violence already planned. Yet the world outside these rooms remained in suspense. Many hoped that the pact might prevent war. Others feared that it signaled a new age of cooperation between two totalitarian powers. Neither hope nor fear matched reality. The pact did not create stability. It created an illusion of stability. The moment Hitler believed the Soviet Union no longer served his interests, he would attack. Stalin misread Hitler's ambitions. He believed the Führer would avoid a two-front war as long as possible. In reality, Hitler saw the pact as a temporary shield, one that allowed him to fight in the West while preparing for the real war in the East. The most tragic aspect of the pact was the immediate human cost. Millions of people living in the regions divided by the secret protocol had no idea that their lives were being rearranged by two dictators who viewed borders as lines on a map. Poland lost its independence. The Baltic states were occupied. Families faced displacement, imprisonment, or execution, depending on which occupying power took control. Ordinary people had no voice in the negotiations that determined their fate. They were simply absorbed into the geopolitical ambitions of two regimes that valued power over humanity. The Pact's legacy is easy to misunderstand. It was not an alliance in the traditional sense. It was not a friendship. It was not a truce built on trust or shared values. It was a temporary convenience, a moment when two powers paused their hostility to carve up their neighbors. The world watched, confused and horrified, as two ideological enemies cooperated in a way that exposed the true priorities of both systems: control, expansion, and domination. If you're still watching, take a second to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because this was only the first piece of the larger story. The next parts will take this mess even deeper. The strange partnership between Hitler and Stalin survived only because both men believed they were smarter than the other. The pact never created trust. It created an arena where two huge egos fought a private race to see who could lie faster, manipulate harder, and control the pace of events more aggressively. Each side understood that the other side was dishonest, but both dictators convinced themselves that their own intelligence was superior, their own ideology was destined to dominate, and their own strategy would turn the temporary pause in hostility into a long-term advantage. This ego trap shaped every decision after the pact. Hitler believed Stalin was naive and slow. Stalin believed Hitler was reckless and predictable. The result was a diplomatic contest built on arrogance rather than strategy, and the consequences were catastrophic for millions of people who had no choice but to live inside their fantasies. Hitler walked into this arrangement with a level of confidence that bordered on the irrational. His belief in Germany's superiority, both racial and military, was so strong that he saw the pact not as a partnership, but as a convenient flashlight he could switch off whenever he wanted. The image he carried in his mind was simple. He would crush the Western powers first. He would force Britain to surrender or retreat into irrelevance. He would keep France under occupation. Once the Western Front was secured, he would turn east and destroy the Soviet Union in one quick, decisive blow. His generals warned him repeatedly about the size of the Soviet Union and the potential depth of its manpower. Yet Hitler dismissed these warnings with the same confidence he used to silence economic advisors, diplomats, and intelligence officers in the years before the war. He spoke about the USSR as if it were a disorganized giant that would collapse the moment German tanks rolled across the border. He believed this because his ideology told him the Slavic world was inferior. His racial theories shaped his military calculations. To him, Soviet citizens were subjects who would panic at the first sign of German strength. He pointed to the Red Army's terrible performance in the Winter War with Finland as evidence that the Soviets had no real capacity to resist a disciplined mechanized assault. He ignored the fact that the Winter War revealed a Soviet command system recovering from the purges, not a permanent weakness. He saw what he wanted to see. Every fact that confirmed his worldview felt profound. Every fact that contradicted it was dismissed as nonsense. This delusion drove his confidence in Operation Barbarossa long before it had a name. He believed his previous victories proved his instincts were flawless. Poland fell quickly. France fell even faster. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, and Greece all collapsed under the rapid tempo of German operations. These victories created a narrative in his mind that nothing could resist German willpower. He used those victories as fuel for his own ego. He pointed to them as proof that the Wehrmacht was the greatest military force in history. The idea that the Soviet Union might fight harder or longer than France did not occur to him because he refused to see the USSR as an equal opponent. His worldview demanded that Russia collapse. Therefore, in his mind, it would collapse. On the other side, Stalin watched these events with fear masked by forced calm. He understood that Germany was a threat, but he convinced himself that he could delay the inevitable by following a rigid doctrine of non-provocation. He ordered Soviet newspapers to praise Germany. He ordered Soviet diplomats to cooperate fully with German demands. He continued to send raw materials, grain and oil to Germany, even as German troops prepared for war. This level of submission seems foolish when viewed from the outside, yet his ego shaped his decisions as much as Hitler's ego shaped his own. Stalin believed he was the master of long-term strategic deception. He believed that he understood Hitler's mind better than anyone else. He believed the Pact gave him control over the pace of events. His own propaganda described him as the architect of Soviet destiny. That image demanded he show no panic, no alarm, and no public signs of defensive preparation. Stalin's belief that he could outmaneuver Hitler came from decades of political survival. He rose to power through manipulation, purges, and psychological warfare. He viewed foreign relations through that same lens. He assumed Hitler operated primarily through calculation rather than ideology. Stalin believed he could delay a German attack by appearing weak, friendly, and predictable. He convinced himself that Hitler would avoid a two-front war at all costs. So if the Soviet Union avoided provocation, Germany would focus on Britain for years. Stalin did not understand that Hitler's hatred of the Soviet Union was not a temporary goal. It was the core of his worldview. Hitler believed the future of Germany depended on conquering Eastern territory. This belief was not negotiable, and Stalin's refusal to accept this created the most dangerous miscalculation of his life. The speed with which Hitler prepared to betray the Pact left Stalin confused, but not because he lacked intelligence. Stalin had strong evidence that Germany was preparing for war. British intelligence sent warnings. Soviet spies sent warnings. German troop movements provided physical evidence. But Stalin filtered these warnings through the lens of his own ego. He believed he understood the timing better than any foreign agent. He believed he could read Hitler better than any intelligence report. When German generals insisted that the Red Army would collapse within months, Hitler believed them because their predictions matched his ideology. When Soviet intelligence insisted that Germany planned to attack soon, Stalin dismissed them because their warnings contradicted his assumptions. Both dictators performed the same mental trick. They believed information only when it confirmed their worldview. They rejected everything that challenged it. This dynamic created a strange symmetry. Hitler believed the USSR was weak because he needed it to be weak. Stalin believed Germany would delay its attack because he needed Germany to delay its attack. Their beliefs shaped their strategy more than reality did. This mutual delusion reached its peak in 1941. Hitler convinced himself that the campaign would last 10 weeks. His generals designed timetables that assumed complete Soviet collapse before winter. German propaganda portrayed the USSR as a rotten structure that would crumble under pressure. Stalin, meanwhile, continued to insist that any German aggression was accidental or the work of rogue officers. He refused to let Soviet border units return fire, even when German reconnaissance planes flew deep into Soviet territory. His orders confused his own officers. His insistence on avoiding provocation left the Red Army exposed, POORLY positioned, and unable to respond quickly when the invasion began. The most revealing part of this story is the way each dictator interpreted the other's behavior. Hitler viewed Stalin's caution as fear. He believed the Soviets were intimidated because they accepted German demands without resistance. He mistook strategy for weakness. Stalin viewed Hitler's aggressive expansion as overextension. He believed Germany would collapse under the weight of its own victories. He mistook ambition for vulnerability. Each leader built a mental image of the other that fit neatly into his own ideology. Neither image had any relationship to reality. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the scale of Hitler's ego became clear. He believed the invasion would be the final test of German destiny. He believed the Wehrmacht would crush the Soviet Union with the same speed it crushed France. He believed the Pact had served its purpose. He believed the future of Europe would be determined in a battle that he had already declared won in his own mind. His ego did not allow the possibility of failure. His arrogance did not permit him to imagine a long war. His belief in German superiority shaped every assumption behind the campaign. That mindset led to one of the largest miscalculations in military history. This was the second part of the story. The ego that guided these decisions would only grow more destructive as the Pact unraveled. Stalin's blinders, a fatal case of wishful thinking. Stalin walked into the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with a kind of confidence that looked solid on paper but was hollow under the surface. He wanted peace, not because he believed Hitler was trustworthy, but because he believed he could buy time. That single idea drove every decision he made in the years leading up to the German invasion. He needed space to build factories, to move industry east, to grow the Red Army, and to try to repair the damage he caused with the political terror of the 1930s. He told himself the Pact would give him a shield. What he ignored was that the shield had cracks from the moment the ink dried. Hitler did not hide his intentions. Hitler wrote them down. Stalin read them, then acted like they were fiction. The strangest part of this story is how many chances Stalin had to avoid the shock that came in June 1941. His intelligence network was one of the most wide-reaching on Earth. He had spies in Germany, in Japan, in the Balkans, even inside the Nazi military command. They sent him warnings again and again. His best agents risked their lives to deliver messages that spelled out the exact plan, the exact season, even the likely number of divisions that would cross into Soviet territory. The most famous of these spies, Richard Sorge, sent reports from Tokyo that made it clear Hitler was preparing a massive invasion. He delivered dates and troop movements with a level of detail that would make any modern intelligence agency stop what it was doing and call an emergency meeting. Stalin did not stop. He did not call a meeting. He did not even believe the reports. He dismissed Sorge as a drunk, even though Sorge was one of the sharpest intelligence officers of the century. Stalin also ignored warnings from his own border commanders. When officers from the western districts sent reports about German armored units massing near the frontier, he accused them of paranoia, fear-mongering, or outright disloyalty. He punished some of them for spreading panic, even when they presented evidence like photographs, intercepted messages, and the testimony of scouts. Understanding why Stalin acted this way requires going back to the Great Purge. Stalin did not simply clean out political rivals, he destroyed the upper ranks of the Red Army. He removed the very people who had fought in the Civil War and who understood the kind of threat Germany posed. Men who had real battlefield experience, who had read Hitler's writings, who had studied German tactics, who could read the buildup of a modern mechanized force, were either executed or sent to the Gulag. Their replacements were young, inexperienced, or terrified of making the wrong move. A wrong move under Stalin was not a mistake. It was a death sentence. That climate of fear stripped the Red Army of initiative. Imagine a commander stationed near the western border. He wakes up to reports of German engineers building bridges across rivers near the frontier. His scouts bring him notes about long armored columns moving at night. He can hear the sound of engines from across the line. A commander in any other country would alert the high command. But in Stalin's Soviet Union, that commander has to weigh the noise of tanks against the memory of seeing colleagues arrested at night. He knows that Stalin has already called several warnings, provocations. He knows people who have been executed for raising alarms, so he stays silent. Or he softens the report. or he writes something vague to protect himself. Fear shapes every word. Stalin created that fear, and it cost him the truth. The wishful thinking did not end with the purges. Stalin believed he could manage Hitler by feeding him land, resources, and time. After Poland fell, the Soviets gained territory that acted as a defensive buffer. Stalin convinced himself that this buffer made him safe. He moved the border west and felt secure enough to ignore the huge risk building on the horizon. He also believed that Germany would not open a second front while still fighting Britain. This was the same mistake Napoleon made more than a century earlier. The idea that Germany would avoid a two-front war felt reasonable on the surface, but Hitler was not a reasonable man. He was driven by ideology first and strategy second. He saw the Soviet Union not as a threat, but as the center of his long-term dream of empire. He wanted the land, he wanted the grain, he wanted the oil fields, and he wanted the Soviet state erased. Stalin read Mein Kampf. He knew Hitler's worldview, yet he convinced himself that ideology could be paused if the economic incentives were strong enough. The Soviet Union shipped Germany massive amounts of raw materials. Grain, oil, cotton, timber, metals, even rubber moved west in steady flows. Stalin looked at the numbers and told himself Hitler would never destroy such a profitable arrangement. What he missed was that Hitler saw trade not as partnership, but as preparation. Every barrel of Soviet oil allowed German tanks to train. Every ton of Soviet grain fed the German army. Stalin was fueling the force that planned to destroy him. He still believed the Pact held value. Hitler believed the Pact was a temporary mask. The deeper problem was Stalin's own mindset. He built a system that made it easy for him to hear only what he wanted. When scared subordinates tell a leader only good news, the leader begins to mistake silence for safety. Reports passed through layers of officials who filtered anything they thought Stalin did not want to hear. Bad news died before it reached his desk. That is how he could insist that the warnings were false even when the German troop buildup was visible from Soviet observation posts. When German planes flew reconnaissance over Soviet territory, Stalin ordered his air defense not to fire. He believed it was a test, and he wanted to avoid giving Hitler an excuse to break the pact. When German soldiers crossed into Soviet land by mistake, he ordered commanders to send them back without confrontation. He told his officers to avoid provocation, even when provocation was already coming from the German side. He held to the illusion that he had time, even when he no longer had days. The strangest example of Stalin's denial came weeks before the invasion, when several soldiers deserted from the German lines and crossed into Soviet territory. They told Soviet officials that the invasion would begin soon. These deserters might have been the most valuable human sources Stalin had, because they were not spies or diplomats. They were men with dirt on their boots and the simple, blunt truth on their tongues. Stalin had them interrogated, then insisted they were British plants sent to create panic. He did not consider that the easiest explanation was the right one. Germany was preparing to attack. His wishful thinking built a chain of errors that stretched from Moscow to the smallest outpost on the frontier. Entire divisions were not allowed to go to full readiness. Ammunition remained locked in depots. Aircraft were parked wing-to-wing on airfields, easy targets for the Luftwaffe. Units that should have been dug in were still in their barracks. Even when the first shells landed on June 22, 1941, some commanders radioed for clarification because they still believed Germany could not be attacking. Stalin wanted peace so badly that he created a world in which danger looked like safety. He chose the Pact because he thought it would quiet the storm. But the storm was already forming, and the man he trusted to keep it at bay had been calling for thunder long before the first strike hit. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not appear out of thin air. It grew out of the wreckage of the First World War, a wreckage so deep that even 20 years later, Europe was still walking through it. The Pact, the invasion of Poland, the division of Eastern Europe, the sudden union of two dictators who hated each other, all of it had roots in a peace settlement that promised stability but delivered resentment. The Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk did not close the wounds of the war. They pressed on them until they swelled into something else. The Pact of 1939 was not a fresh betrayal. It was an echo from a war that never truly ended. Germany entered the 1930s with a memory that would not go away. The Germans remembered the humiliation of Versailles in vivid detail. The treaty stripped land, took resources, and cut the army to a size that made the country feel exposed. Germans grew up hearing that their fathers had been stabbed in the back, and that the peace settlement was a punishment disguised as diplomacy. This resentment was not limited to extremists. It was common at dinner tables, in schools, in newspapers, in quiet conversations between people who wanted to return to dignity. When Hitler came along and promised to reclaim lost territories, many citizens saw him not as a threat, but as someone giving them back what they believed was theirs. He spoke about the Polish corridor, the Sudetenland, and Danzig with a sense of ownership that millions of Germans shared. These places were not symbols of conquest in their minds. They were symbols of restoration. On the other side of the map stood the Soviet Union, which carried its own anger. Before the Soviet state even formed, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers to exit the First World War. The treaty hacked away huge pieces of Russian territory, including Ukraine, the Baltic states, and parts of Belarus and Poland. It was one of the harshest treaties ever forced on a major power. The Bolsheviks accepted it only because their army was collapsing and the revolution was still unstable. They hoped they could reverse it later, but they carried a sense of violation that lingered. When the Civil War ended and the Soviet state became stronger, leaders in Moscow looked west and still saw land they believed had been stolen from them when they were weak. They never forgot it. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact allowed both Germany and the Soviet Union to get back what they believed they deserved. When the two regimes agreed to divide Poland, each side felt it was correcting the past. Germany saw the takeover of Western Poland as a reversal of Versailles. The Soviet Union saw the takeover of Eastern Poland as the undoing of Brest-Litovsk. It was not cooperation built on trust. It was cooperation built on shared resentment toward the treaties that followed the First World War. The moment the pact was signed, both sides acted like they were cashing in old debts. Poland became the unlucky center of this storm. After the First World War, Poland re-emerged as a nation for the first time in over a century. It was formed out of land that once belonged to the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. None of those states were happy to see that land gone. The Second Polish Republic carried borders that were always contested. When Germany and the Soviet Union carved Poland apart in 1939, they did not see it as theft. They saw it as repossession. The soldiers who marched in thought they were reclaiming pieces of their empires. That belief did not make the invasion any less violent, but it explains why the pact worked long enough for the first blow to land. The strange part is how openly both sides justified their actions with references to older treaties. German propaganda claimed that the Polish corridor cut Germany in half and that Versailles created an unnatural border. Soviet propaganda claimed that Eastern Poland was populated with Ukrainians and Belarusians who belonged in the Soviet family. Both arguments came from the same belief that the peace of 1918 was flawed. Neither side was interested in respecting the borders drawn after the Great War. Both wanted to rewrite them. This sense of unfinished business shaped decisions long before the pact. When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, when he annexed Austria, when he demanded the Sudetenland, he always pointed back to Versailles. Each aggressive move was framed as a correction, not a conquest. The world watched and hoped that giving him what he wanted would calm him. In reality, each concession made him bolder because he believed the treaties were illegitimate. The Soviet Union watched this too, and Stalin saw the pattern. He knew that Germany was moving against the treaties one piece at a time. He assumed Germany would eventually clash with the Western powers, and he hoped the Soviet Union could stay out long enough to rebuild. But the pact changed the timing. It brought the dominoes crashing down faster than anyone expected. There is a scene that historians often describe when they talk about the partition of Poland. German and Soviet officers met in the middle of the country after the invasion and held a joint parade. They smiled at each other, saluted, and then quickly went back to their own sides. That moment captures the strange logic of the pact. They were not allies in any real sense. They were two powers marching through a country that neither believed had a right to exist. They were performing the final act in a play that began 2 decades earlier when the old empires crashed at the end of the First World War. Even beyond Poland, the secret protocol of the pact outlined zones of interest that followed old imperial borders. The Soviet Union took the Baltic states because they had been part of the Russian Empire. Germany looked toward Western Poland and parts of Lithuania because these areas once sat inside the German Empire. The whole agreement was a map of grievances written in ink. The lines drawn across Eastern Europe were not new. They were copies of older lines that had been erased in 1918. The Pact did not create new tensions. It reopened wounds that had never healed. The failure of the First World War peace settlement becomes clear when you look at how fast the map changed once the Pact went into effect. Within months, borders shifted like sand. Governments fell. Armies moved into positions that echoed the old imperial frontiers. The world learned that a peace built on humiliation does not last. Versailles tried to weaken Germany so much that it could never start another war. Brest-Litovsk tried to humiliate Russia to the point of collapse. Both treaties pushed empires to the breaking point, and the bitterness that followed became tinder for men like Hitler and Stalin. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the spark that lit the new fire, but the fuel had been stacked years before. The pact only made sense in a world where both sides believed they had been wronged by history. It gave them permission to break the borders they never accepted. The invasion of Poland was not the beginning of something new. It was the conclusion of something old, a violent rewrite of a peace that had been failing since the day it was signed. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, from the very beginning, was a contract written on sand. Both sides signed with full knowledge that betrayal was baked into the deal. Hitler and Stalin, despite their public handshakes and photographs, understood intuitively that their alliance was temporary. Both were dictators who trusted only power and feared only weakness. Yet for a moment, both convinced themselves that the other could be managed, that promises could be kept long enough to serve immediate ambitions. The pact was a textbook example of strategic stupidity mixed with cautious ego. It gave each tyrant breathing room, but it also set the stage for a collision that had been inevitable from the day the ink dried. From the German perspective, Hitler had no real interest in sharing power. He needed the Soviets to stay neutral while he focused on the West. He could not risk a two-front war before the German military had achieved its immediate objectives in Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France. He promised Stalin half of Poland and pieces of the Baltic states, but there was no trust behind the promise. For Hitler, the pact was a tactical pause, a way to secure his eastern flank while pursuing his obsession with Western dominance. Stalin, similarly, saw the pact as a shield against immediate conflict, a way to buy time for the Red Army to recover from the devastation of the Great Purge. Both leaders approached the deal with one eye open, fully aware that it was built on lies, half-truths, and mutual exploitation. The most revealing aspect of the pact is the secret protocol itself. On paper, the agreement was a non-aggression treaty. In practice, it was a blueprint for the partition of Europe. Poland was the first victim, carved neatly down the middle. Germany took the West, the Soviet Union the East. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were ceded to the Soviets. Finland and Bessarabia were also earmarked for Soviet influence. On the surface, it looked like a mutually beneficial arrangement. Behind the scenes, each side knew the borders were temporary. Each side anticipated the day when the other would be forced aside. The secret protocol was proof that the pact was never intended as a foundation for lasting peace. It was a roadmap for mutual exploitation. Once the invasion of Poland began on September 1, 1939, the pact functioned exactly as intended for a brief moment. German and Soviet forces advanced from opposite sides, meeting in the center without firing at each other. The world was stunned by the speed and efficiency of the conquest. Hitler achieved his goal in the West, while Stalin secured the eastern territories without immediate resistance. Yet even as their armies avoided confrontation, both leaders were calculating the next betrayal. The pact's magic worked only because both tyrants were temporarily restrained by necessity, not trust. Each move was measured, each decision a balance between gain and potential disaster. They were partners only by circumstance, not by choice. While the early months of the pact gave the illusion of cooperation, cracks appeared almost immediately in strategic planning. Hitler, focused on Western expansion, was already preparing for the future conflict with the Soviet Union. German intelligence monitored the Red Army, studied troop movements, and identified weaknesses. Stalin, despite receiving warnings from multiple sources, including his own spies about Hitler's aggressive intentions, remained hesitant to act preemptively. His reliance on the pact created a dangerous lull in defensive preparations. Both sides were fully aware that the other was untrustworthy, yet both allowed expedience to override caution. It was a classic example of tactical, short-term thinking overshadowing long-term strategic clarity. The danger inherent in the Pact became unavoidable the moment Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. Over 2 million German troops crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching more than 1,800 miles. It was the largest invasion in human history, executed with precision and brutality. Stalin had ignored numerous intelligence warnings and refused to mobilize in advance. When the German juggernaut struck, the Red Army was caught unprepared, suffering catastrophic losses in men, material, and territory. Cities fell rapidly, infrastructure collapsed, and the civilian population endured unimaginable terror. The very act that each side had secretly feared mutual betrayal finally came to pass. The Pact, which had temporarily held the two dictators at bay, dissolved in a flash of violence that neither could fully control. The consequences of this inevitable betrayal were staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed in the opening months alone. The war on the Eastern Front became the deadliest theater in human history, exceeding any scale of death and destruction seen in World War I or the early campaigns of World War II. Entire towns were annihilated, villages burned, and armies encircled and destroyed. The temporary convenience of the Pact had turned into an unprecedented catastrophe. The distrust that both leaders carried from the beginning had been the only accurate assessment, yet neither acted early enough to mitigate the carnage. Their initial skepticism and understanding that the other could not be trusted was the sole rational judgment in an otherwise catastrophic deal. The human cost of the failure extended far beyond the battlefield. Civilians bore the brunt of strategic stupidity and mutual deceit. Occupation policies, forced labor, mass executions, and starvation campaigns became common as German and Soviet forces sought control over territories they had once divided on paper. The millions of lives lost in the East are a stark testament to how temporary political convenience can create permanent horror. Had either side approached the Pact with more caution, or acknowledged the inevitability of betrayal, the scale of death might have been reduced. Instead, the alliance between two tyrants, always based on suspicion, escalated into one of history's most destructive conflicts. Even within the military hierarchies of both nations, the impact was profound. German generals, trained to anticipate rapid victories, underestimated the resilience and size of the Soviet forces. Soviet commanders, weakened by the purges of the late 1930s, were unable to respond effectively. Both sides suffered from systemic misjudgments that the Pact had temporarily masked. It became clear that while treaties and agreements could change lines on maps, they could not alter human ambition, ego, or the inexorable drive for dominance. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a lesson in the limits of political calculation when confronted by the raw realities of ideology and power. Looking back, the Pact's failure highlights the profound dangers of trusting those whose objectives are fundamentally incompatible with your own. Hitler and Stalin had temporarily aligned because their immediate goals coincided, but their long-term objectives were mutually exclusive. One sought global hegemony through conquest and racial ideology. The other sought security and expansion to consolidate revolutionary power. Their agreement could last only until their spheres of influence collided. Once the collision occurred, there was no mechanism to preserve the alliance. The failure was not surprising. It was inevitable. The history of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact offers a chilling lesson. Temporary convenience, even when backed by careful negotiation, cannot override the inevitability of conflicting objectives when dealing with ruthless actors. Hitler and Stalin, in their hubris, believed they could manipulate the other, control the timing, and secure their goals. They were wrong. The Pact's collapse unleashed a war whose scale and intensity were unimaginable at the time of signing. Millions of lives were lost, cities destroyed, and the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe was forever transformed. The only correct assessment, either leader made the recognition that the other could not be trusted, was utterly ignored in their execution, proving that in alliances forged on deception, foresight can be tragically wasted. The Pact's end in June 1941 was both dramatic and instructive. Operation Barbarossa marked the point at which expedience gave way to inevitability. The temporary convenience of division turned into permanent conflict. The war on the Eastern Front, triggered by the failure of trust, became the engine that consumed millions of lives and reshaped the course of World War II. It demonstrates the high price of ignoring historical grievances, miscalculating intentions, and overestimating control. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a pact of convenience, ultimately illustrated how tactical decisions built on deception and resentment can spiral into strategic catastrophe. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more in-depth explorations of the missteps and decisions that shaped history.